Hey everyone, today we are going to be talking about addressing collective trauma and supporting the well-being of students and school staff. This topic was addressed during a REL Southwest webinar on this topic, and we're going to be talking about we're going to have abbreviated version of this webinar today with our expert, Tammie Causey-Konaté. And if you would like to have access to the full webinar that REL Southwest delivered, that is available to you on the link on this slide. So today, Tammie Causey-Konaté is going to be talking about collective trauma. Thank you, Tammie.
Hello, Jamila. Thank you for welcoming me. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tammie Causey-Konaté, and I'm a senior research consultant at AIR. Today, we'll be talking about understanding collective trauma. We'll explore what collective trauma is. We'll talk about some of its causes and triggering events such as natural, man-made, and medical concerns. We'll also talk about how collective trauma affects us, adults and children. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we can do to create conditions and to work through collective trauma in a way that transforms us for the better, of course. We want to think about, as we do so, culturally sensitive and trauma sensitive approaches that also require us to consider social emotional learning. And so, in short, we want today to reconceptualize what it means to be resilient. We want to move past thinking about getting back to where we were more than a year ago or adapting to where we are presently. And we want to begin to think about how to transform our current circumstances into something amazing, something more powerful, more socially just, and more culturally responsive. So this slide helps us to think about the term itself, collective trauma. And as you'll see here, collective trauma has many synonyms. It is used synonymously with cultural trauma, with community-wide trauma, historic grief, historical trauma, intergenerational or post-traumatic stress disorder, mass trauma, multi-generational trauma, and simultaneous trauma. When we think about trauma in these various terminologies as the forms represent, there are some slight nuances that define them and separate them from one another, but often we see them referenced in the literature to mean one and the same. In addition, we sometimes hear about something that we know very often now, when one family member, for example, is affected by trauma, and that trauma that affects us begins to impact those close to us. And we call that secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. We know there's interfamilial trauma in which family members often cause emotional injury to one another. But today, for the purposes of this work, we will focus primarily on collective trauma as a cultural event, a cultural experience. Let's move on. So, in terms of the definition, we know that cultural trauma, it is a way that members of a collective are impacted. We know from experience this year that collective memory of certain events, certain triggering events, becomes lodged in our memories, in our hearts and minds. And so those experiences become those likely to change the fundamental ways that we view ourselves, that we view one another, the way we talk, the way we walk and see ourselves in the world. So this notion of cultural trauma has to do with taken for granted foundations that are shaken, that are in some ways interrupted in ways that we are not able to find a way back to where we used to be. So we, in a sense, seek out to repair or reinterpret a situation so that it makes sense to us. There are several tenets that hold true to cultural trauma. And when we think about those tenets, there's the sense of shared suffering, the injury to one's collective identity. When I say one's, I mean the group's collective identity around this sense of disaster. As I mentioned earlier, taken for granted norms are disrupted. And often that sense of security we feel by having a collective identity that's strong and firm is fractured. And so when we think about what that means, I want us to just pause for a moment and think about how that feels for us as adults, how we are experiencing through the pandemic a sense of shared suffering, how we are grappling with this collective identity that we hold and how it shifted in light of this event. And also, I want us to think about what we have no longer been able to take for granted and what kinds of identity shifts we've experienced. And when we think about that for ourselves, it's also really interesting and important for us to think about what that means for youngsters. What would a first grader or a kindergartner view from this vantage point entering schooling for the first time? What would an adolescent think of? Perhaps an adolescent approaching the prom or graduation or other important milestones. And so the sense of shared suffering and the absence of close contact in schools because of, some of the school closures and quarantining situations, the sense of collective identity that's disrupted, and also that sense of security. I want us to just ponder that for a moment and hold it in your hearts and minds as we move forward, because this is key to the presentation today. Our conversation is really not only about collective trauma, but what it means for us as educators, what it means for young people, and what it is that we're able to do on a day-to-day basis to really arrive in a better place. When we look at the elements of cultural trauma, we see four listed here. Emotionality. And we can think about maybe back in March 13th or 15th for some of us, 2020, what we felt the moment we heard about the idea that schools were being closed and we would have to shelter in place. Some of us may have felt anxiety or fear or vulnerability, even resentment. And so those are some of the emotions that may surface when an event triggers trauma. Also, blame attribution. In terms of blame, we think often about making meaning of the experience that triggers the trauma by assigning blame to someone. Someone has to be responsible for this. Who made this happen or who didn't do what was necessary to keep this from happening? When we think about identity formation processes, we might question who we are um, based on the role shifts that we're experiencing. We get a chance to think now about what's really important to us. Things that we may have valued highly in the past may take a different place. When we think about social gatherings, we think about attire, the way we present ourselves in the world, what things make us feel a sense of power. Many of those things have shifted. So our identity formation is under development all the time. And then defense mechanisms. Well, to defend ourselves, to protect ourselves and our sense of identity, we do all kinds of things. And many of them offer great bonuses and benefits to larger society. So in this pandemic, we've seen outreach through social media increase. We've seen that sense of agency, even in the streets with protest. We've seen artistic demonstrations such as the versus battles, the music battles we saw on social media, and online concerts, in-person theatrical performances. I saw recently at the park a middle school band performing the sounds of the pandemic. And it was really powerful. So we find a way to draw meaning from these experiences linked to cultural trauma, although emotionality is certainly something that is impactful, the blame attribution and the identity formation or reformation process. So as we think about those taken for granted foundations, I want us to take another moment to reflect now, just to think about what it is that you took for granted, that's been shaken as a foundation for you. Just pause for a moment and ponder that. And if you're at home, you might take a few moments, pause your camera and pause your screen and just go ahead and reflect a moment and jot down what it is for you that's been changed in terms of taken for granted foundations, and do so also for the young people that you work with. So some of the things that we know very well and that many of you may have talked about had to do with the obvious, right? Sheltering in place, social distance, mask wearing, hand washing and sanitizing our spaces, avoiding gatherings and social events that we love so much, particularly holiday gatherings, getting tested, waiting for the vaccine, and also taking the vaccine, thinking about side effects. So, even these we can think of in more current terms. So now that the vaccine has been distributed and disseminated among larger society, and many of us have taken it, we now think about, can I hug my grandkids? Can I have parties again? Do I really need to wear the mask? Am I in danger? What about folks who haven't taken it? Should I invite them to be in close proximity to me? And so these same questions arise. Things we never would have thought about before become prominent in our decision making and our thought patterns. And so when we consider now, we've been talking about COVID, but I want us to delve a little bit deeper into COVID as a triggering event for trauma. And I want us to think about the notion that trauma, collective and cultural trauma, are really not events, but they are responses to events. We talked a little bit earlier about what happens when you encounter maybe something that is so traumatic, violent, that it causes your cognition in some ways to pause and your emotional center takes over. And so you may feel racing heart or pounding heart. You might feel the tensing of muscles. You may feel perspiration or warmth take you over. And so these triggering events leave indelible markings for us. And so when we think first though about trauma, I want us to recognize that we start with cultural identities intact. We have our belief systems, we have our knowledge bases, certain behaviors that are normative for us, and traumas that have occurred previously that we've adapted to in some way. And those cultural identities for Americans are often the sense of being strong and brave and courageous, almost invincible. We also think of ourselves as survivors. But when we are newly traumatized by an event such as COVID, we are challenged with regard to our cultural identities. And we may begin to think, wow, do we really have to do these things? What about my rights? Is this not a free country? And so those same challenges that come toward our identity, our sense of self as a cultural group, now are thrown into flux. And so when they're thrown into flux, we have this sense that we we might want to challenge, I should say. We think about, why isn't there a cure for this? And oh, if this is the cure, Why am I still having to wear a mask? Why can't we make everyone take this vaccine? When is this going to be over? And so the things that we would normally suspend in terms of judgment, in terms of opinion giving, in terms of feeling this sense of annoyance or anxiety may come in a rush of our psyches, a rush of our persons, and our behaviors may be transformed. And so I want us to think about this because um, when we look at collective trauma and this reality that over 2 million humans lost their lives worldwide during the pandemic so far, and almost 500,000 or more, 500,000 deaths occurred in our nation alone. There's really something that we will not forget in anytime soon. Um, 95% of the deaths were of those 50 years and older. And so we know also that um, this new variant of COVID-19 is about 50% more contagious than the original. So when we think about these events, we know that we will be changed as a collective forever. We will be able years from now to be able to think about this year, this past 2 years, and how we were and how we are, what we've learned, um, and how it's impacted the way we navigate the world. In terms of collective trauma, it's so important for us to recognize that it is defined as an entire group's reaction. Yeah, it has to do though, as I mentioned earlier, with not only the event itself, but the way we reproduce the event and how over time we reconstruct the trauma in many ways as we talk about it, as we plan to overcome it, we relive certain parts of it and may reactivate certain physical and physiological indicators of it. It emotionally connects us though. These triggers and the events that we use that we refer to as triggers connect us, not just within our households or local cultural groups, but across the globe in this case. And in this notion of collective trauma, we realize that it does not go away easily. And so what happens in the course of the traumatic event remains with us long after the event is over. And it may last through and across generations. That, remember, we call that intergenerational trauma. And so that is so important for us to think about because as we encounter young folks in school, sometimes we are not aware that they have been in the presence of adults who experience trauma, whose behaviors are reflected in the children who may not have had any involvement directly with the trauma. So there's that sense of intergenerational transference. It can occur through stories we tell, through behaviors in which we engage, and in other experiences as well. And so finally, collective trauma causes us to recognize that we are interconnected in an ecosystem of interdependence. And that ecosystem includes not only health and medicine, but education, social, economic, and political landscapes. So, collective traumas are reflections of neither individual suffering nor actual events, but symbolic renderings that reconstruct and imagine them. And so rather than descriptions of what they are, we start to think about what must have been, what should be, and even what may be. So as we think about these renderings, we'll move into this experience of reflecting another moment or two. As we reflect, I'd like us to think about experiences such as natural disasters, in the way of hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, floods. Let's think about man-made disasters, genocide, violent colonization, slavery, human trafficking, even acts of terror. Let's think about health crises such as the Ebola crisis, SARS, or HIV/AIDS. Now let's think a little bit more about systemic destruction that may take place deliberately, um, and cause one to be identified one dimensionally by religion, ethnicity, skin color, and such. Maybe we might use the Holocaust as an example, the extermination of indigenous native people as an example. When we think about these things, what is it that comes to mind? What emotion comes to mind? As you look across this list, and we see everything from the California wildfires and Hurricane Katrina to the Trail of Tears, to the Atlantic slave trade, to the Parkland shooting in 2018, George Floyd's murder in 2020. When we think about those things, what emotions come to mind? And as you begin to call up those emotions, I want us to think about this. Remember, trauma has a neurological impact. When we recall a violent event, one that brought about extreme fear, for example, we may note very different physiological responses than what are average and normative for us when things are going well. What we need to recognize is that these same kinds of experiences mark actual changes to the brain structure. And so when the brain reproduces a fight or flight response, um, something is triggered, and the chemicals that are released are stress hormones that help protect our bodies, right? But they store the memory of the event. And so when we think about these events, what we have is a trigger that releases some of those same stress hormones that remind us of the event. Well, we know also that remembering the events is a way that we can come together and galvanize as a larger community and take steps to do things that are intentional, that are transformational, that are empowering, that show our sense of agency, and that give us a sense that we do have control over what it is that we choose to do. So, what are the potential effects of collective trauma? I mentioned some of the physical or physiological effects, but we know that mental health and well being are certainly impacted. We know that adults are experiencing challenges with mental health and well being, as are children. And so sometimes we may feel depression, anxiety, helplessness, um, a sense of emotional depletion. In terms of intergenerational trauma, we know that we're experiencing sometimes a sense of pain and anxiety and hurt that is not only ours, that kind of stems across generations. And I mentioned earlier, these feelings and realities may be passed on through stories, through the way we cope with various situations, through behaviors we exhibit. There's also the threat to identity and culture that is a part of that effect of collective trauma. And when we think about that threat to identity and culture, we respond to it in a way that may be negative. In some instances, we actually find ourselves being very defensive. Um, in other instances, we find ourselves kind of recreating the truth so that in some ways our own guilt may be minimized, or we may even deny certain events. We experience cognitive dissonance, if you will. This is something that is often found among perpetrators, those who have helped to initiate those triggering events, because all of us really try to make meaning of the events that trigger these feelings. In terms of social solidarity, we've seen positive, we've come together in some instances, and these events that trigger for us the sense of trauma may cause us to find value, to move with a sense of love and compassion, humanity, and vulnerability. We have an increased sense of empathy. And we are now, because we're experiencing this collectively, more readily available to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. In terms of societal changes, they're both positive and negative. And we may experience shifts in practices, policies, even social norms that may be for our well being. In other instances, we may find them restrictive or punitive. And so there is that balance between pros and cons. We'll move on now to talk a bit about collective traumas that are cascading collective traumas. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that now, because the collective traumas are very powerful on their own, as you know. But when you encounter a series of compounding catastrophes, we refer to those as cascading collective traumas. They may be both historic and concurrent in nature, and they seem to yield a stronger emotional response with each new exposure. And so we have lots of examples. The pandemic itself is one. And we can think about race-based traumas that we're seeing play out all around the world. We've seen the impact on China and the Chinese culture in America, brutal killings of unarmed Black people in America, such as Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. We saw the videotape death of George Floyd. And then we've seen social and political unrest and divisiveness at a record rate, even at the Capitol. And so when we couple those things with hurricanes, heat waves, pestilence, disastrous wildfires, we know that these compounding catastrophes definitely have to take a toll on us as a collective. So the impact of cascading collective traumas across our nation has shown up in a number of different ways. So we've had our sense of value, our sense of cultural identity challenged in terms of that rugged individualism and self-determination that is essentially American. We've seen ourselves now have to really think differently about individualism and come together more as a collective to save each other and to save ourselves. So we're sharing space, we're sharing food and resources, we're sharing ourselves very intimately, even if it's across a distance. We've seen a sense of global interdependence. And so the notion of the global village is very real and very tangible. And so we're looking not at just local news and national news, but international news, because there's something there for us. The crucial role of families is showing up as well. We are, in many cases, rendering care to one another. We know that more young children are caring for siblings or staying in the presence of grandparents and extended family members, just so that the family can continue to survive. When I think about survival, of course, economic vulnerability and food security shows up. But as we work toward not being so vulnerable, but having a sense of economic security and food security, again, we get this sharing of resources. We have this need to tend to one another so that some of us can go to work while others of us must stay at home. Then there's the disproportionate impact on number of citizens, large numbers of citizens, particularly those who've been marginalized historically. And so we see that show up not only in education, but in mortality rates, health, housing, transportation, and income. It's very real. the digital divide. We've become much more aware of the disparities, particularly for school age youth, when it comes to access to Wi-Fi and broadband, access to digital resources. Um, and those have been identified as essential. And so our government has taken steps now to ensure that all students have the access they need. But we could see very easily how fragile our schooling experience was in the absence of that equity, that digital equity. There are inequities that are linked to racism, classism, that of course run the spectrum across the health, employment, education, pipelines. And so when we think about these inequities, they're not just linked to racism, they're linked to classism as well. And we see them show up, and these cascading events around them exacerbate, if you will, our physical, emotional, and mental experiences. Finally, when we think about advancements in science and medicine in particular, we have now come to recognize that they are not sufficient. They're just simply inadequate. And where we've lost over 100,000 folks in the month immediately following the release of the vaccine, and where we have seen more people rise up to be vaccinated. I think about half of our nation is vaccinated at this point. We still recognize, though, that there is a disparity with representation. So only 5% of our nation's doctors are African American, and 5.8% are Latinx. And so, this notion of seeing yourself in your physician and engendering that sense of comfort and ease may not be present. But during this vaccination period, um, we've seen evidence that our nation is recognizing that sense of trust, and trust building is important. So you see various um, people on social media, on the mass media, who are trusted in families, homes, and communities, inviting them to really take care, inviting them to be vaccinated, inviting them to push back across this, against this triggering event, this trauma. So when we think about collective cascading traumas in the US with regard to education, we know that teacher shortages have been intensified. We know that before March of 2020, we saw that we had a teacher shortage. We had lost almost 500,000 teachers back in April of 2020. And so that is being exacerbated. We're seeing increased retirement numbers. We're seeing shifts in what is available in terms of professional learning experiences. And we're seeing that there's an uptick in the way we care for one another as educators. At the start of meetings now, we're checking in to see how people are doing emotionally. We are making opportunities to deal with teacher, adult, parent, social, and emotional well being. There was a time when we thought about social and emotional learning as something that was for young people, for students in particular. Now we're seeing that we must all care for ourselves in that way. Also, we see that suicide rates, suicidal ideation is on the increase. We see that academic failure is highly problematic. And so these collective challenges plague us and require us to rise up and do something collectively. As we do move forward, um, we notice that sometimes we're out of step a bit. I think about the school policies and practices, for example, and we know that there's a slight misalignment of those that comes with the abrupt shift from being face to face to being partially hybrid, partially face to face, being virtual. And so that reminds us that as we act, we must act in the moment, but with the expectation that we are not returning to where we were, but we're moving not to adapt to where we are, but to transition and transform in a way that we are able to apply our learnings. We're able to apply the understanding and the wisdom that we are now made privy to. There's been a disproportionate impact of COVID also, as I mentioned, on historically marginalized or underserved individuals in a number of locations, not just associated with school, but associated with those things that are linked back to school. And so engagement rates in schools that serve predominantly Black and Hispanic students are lagging behind. And we understand that also for Indigenous students and Pacific Islanders, the same experience is happening at record rates. There's a disproportionate impact of COVID on our physical and social emotional well-being. And we know that this is impacting again children from racial and ethnic groups that have been underserved historically. And so, as we make decisions about restructuring educational systems, as we make decisions about resources and which resources are of value, it becomes really of great import that we make these decisions grounded in the realities of those who are the most vulnerable, of those who have remained underserved, of those who continue to be marginalized. And so rather than assigning um, resources without that in mind, we need to hear the voices of those who are greatly involved. We need to humanize our actions. And this is what trauma calls for. So at this point, we'll shift a little bit and we'll talk a bit more now. I kind of gave you a bit of a teaser, but we'll talk a bit more about working through cultural trauma and what that can mean. And I'll share a 4-step model that I recommend for working through cultural trauma. We'll discuss how participants can use this model with students or staff to reflect on cultural experiences, culturally traumatic experiences that have taken place within their communities. We'll talk about it with regard to social justice and equity. And so at this point, as we move to the next slide, you'll see that there's case one, blurred homeschool boundaries. And so this example, refers to the notion of what happens when we begin to apply the norms, the traditions. We hold to those foundational non-negotiables because we have a sense of comfort, right? In this case, students in Louisiana, 2 students, a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, experienced disciplinary action that recommended them for expulsion. And it had to do with their having BB guns in their possession. So while they were in possession of BB guns, they were not in an on-site school setting. They were both in class, in their homes, receiving virtual instruction. In one case, the student moved the BB gun to keep his younger sibling from tripping over it, and it became visible and became problematic. And of course, it was a breach of school rules. In the other case, during a break, the youngster showed classmates the BB gun, allegedly. And of course, that was a breach of school rules because there was the possession of this firearm. Um, since that event, a number of things have happened in the state of Louisiana, including legislative responses to this. But again, when we shift, we make abrupt shifts very rapidly due to triggering events that cause trauma. We want to be careful not to re-traumatize or exacerbate traumatic experiences with short-sightedness. So we must begin to think about our present reality and plan to move beyond that present reality. The next slide helps us to think about academics and how our youth are experiencing academics in this time of healing and recovery. And so we know our young folks are very resilient, but we see from this that a county in Georgia has reported a majority of its students failing. And this is failing through virtual learning experiences compared to in-person learning experiences. And just the other day, an intern with whom I'm working mentioned the very opposite of this in a community in Washington, D.C., in which students who were at home taking virtual instruction and who had historically been high failure, have had high failure rates, were experiencing success for the first time. And so we, in North Carolina, 46% of third and 12th graders in Wilson County failed at least one class. And that's more than twice the rate for what happened the year before. So in South Carolina, we see again the report that numbers of students are failing at least one course. So this high failure rate is something again that we must grapple with, because again, when we think about trauma and the physiological response, what does this mean for our students? How are they experiencing this? And so as we scurry about thinking about health and finance and job security, food security, what are young children, what are young adolescents and young adults experiencing? What are they thinking? How are they managing? And what do we owe them in terms of our response to this? So I want us to think for a moment about what we would do if we could empower and arouse agency. I'm talking about just self agency, self transformation. What is it that we can do ourselves that will restore within us this sense of power and efficacy over our realities and over those that are also shaping the experiences of others? What can we do to develop culturally affirming and sustainable solutions? Pause for a moment, think about it, and jot something down. Now, you see before you a list of responses. This list comes from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and it reminds us of steps that we can take to move through cultural trauma. The first step is encourage. It's so important for us to encourage one another and to hold true to the sense of positive collective identity. Sometimes it's easy for us to think about the negative, for us to focus on the injustices we've experienced, the pain. But if we can pull within ourselves, pull from within ourselves the sense of the positive and how we together are stronger and how we together are more able, that is the place to start. Then we begin to map out assets, map out personal, individual, and collective strengths that enable us to provide trauma related services from which all of us may benefit. When we map out our assets, then we move on to engaging stakeholders. We want to engage parents, students, community partners, all of us, other educators, in leveraging those strengths in social networks. So just thinking about developing mechanisms for getting the collective needs met, for getting the unique individual needs met. Finally, well, not finally, but next we want to implement and refine policies and practices that get rid of those barriers and stigmas that have caused us challenges. We want to overcome social adversities. We don't want to do anything to reignite those adversities. And so thinking about being very mindful and humane in the policies and practices that we engage in. And then we want to utilize culturally responsive programming. We want to ensure that we work with a sense of cultural humility, that we are open to recognizing the gifts, the most beautiful attributes and offerings that each of us can render. We want to think about addressing the authentic, real time needs that may be unique and may not respond to a one size fits all offering. We want to also make sure that we do this across sectors, that we reach all of the members of our communities, that we look at and tap into organizations that can help all of us. Neighborhoods should not be left behind, families should not be left behind, and no individual should be left behind. And so my 4-step model for addressing cultural trauma builds on that same set of principles that we looked at earlier. The notion of encouraging and focusing on assets and engaging collectively and being mindful that we're doing something that's not only transformative but sustainable. And so in that way, my process asks you to start with resisting traditional forms of domination. And so we know that when it comes to domination, for example, there are certain narratives that tell us what we should believe. In the pandemic, as we experience it as a collective trauma, one of the things that we're hearing is that Black and Brown people are experiencing this pandemic in ways that are much more pronounced. We hear that they're dying more readily, they're infected with the disease more readily, they're experiencing failure in school more readily, they're less likely to have the resources they need in school to thrive, such as technology related devices and Wi Fi. And if we're not careful, we can hold on to those narratives and assume that the individuals who are experiencing disparate suffering are somehow deficient, somehow inferior, somehow less than. And so we want to resist those traditional narratives, those master narratives that kind of misrepresent reality in a way by omitting or misrepresenting or just providing information that's not fully representative. Then we want to disrupt deficit based discourse regarding the traumatic event. And so you remember from the earlier experience, the earlier list, we talked about encouraging positive collective identity. And so that's one way to do that. Disrupt deficit discourse by thinking about and engaging with others in the collective, coming together to imagine the best and to take stock of the best. And so we're thinking about where we are and the things that we have done well, what we've been able to demonstrate even in the toughest of times. In step 3, we want to empower and arouse agency and creative self-transformation. And so this notion of empowerment is not anything that we extend to someone else. It's really releasing the power within ourselves and looking for that same sense of power to emanate from those around us. And using that power that we share to arouse a sense of response that is not only responsive, but that is creative and imaginative, and that makes us agents of our own future, agents of our own positive transformation. And number 4, we want to develop culturally affirming and sustainable solutions. These are solutions that celebrate who we are, the best of who we are. They don't mute us, they don't require that we change our reality, that we, you know, in any way mute who we are, but they celebrate, affirm, and find the strength and the possibility in those identities in ways that we're able to sustain them over time. And so with that, I'll just ask that you would join me in just really taking some time to delve deeply into your psyche, to think beyond that moment that triggered potentially collective or cultural trauma for you, and to think about where you would have yourself next time this year. What would your state of mind be? What would your state of physical well-being be? What traditions would you have put into place that honor and celebrate your individual strength and the collective strength that surrounds you, that makes it possible for all of our students, all of our young people to thrive? Because as educators, we are physically, mentally, emotionally well, and we expect them to be as well. Are we acting in love? Are we acting in humanity? Are we acting in transparency? Let's give each other some grace. Let's move beyond this sense of collective and cultural trauma toward a new transformative space. Thank you for your time today. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Tammie. That was really great. I think you provided a lot of really, really important information and a lot for us to think about. So we really appreciate you coming and spending your time with us to present this information.
Thank you.
If you're watching this video, I just want to point you to a couple of other resources on the website. We also have a video on social emotional learning and integrating trauma sensitive approaches that's presented by Fausto Lopez. And we also have a video that includes some resources that you can use with your school and district teams, including some evidence-based resources on trauma and collective trauma, as well as action planning templates and research syntheses. So go ahead and check out those videos as well. Thank you so much.